Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
They say you always remember the first time someone made you feel like you weren't enough. For me, it wasn't one single moment. It was 1,000 little ones, strung together like beads on a rosary, each one a quiet sting I tucked away. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't throw tantrums or cry for attention. I learned early that silence was safer than asking questions that wouldn't be answered. And my parents, Mark and Sharon, took that silence and filled it with indifference. They weren't cruel, not in the way you think of cruelty. They were just busy, busy with Kyle. Kyle was born 2 years after me, and from the moment he took his first steps, he walked straight into the center of their universe. I remember watching him in our backyard, barely 4 years old, already being cheered on like he'd won an Olympic gold, just for kicking a soccer ball across the lawn. My dad, in his work boots and baseball cap, would clap like a maniac, while Mom would snap photos like she was documenting the next prodigy. And me, I'd be standing right there holding the juice boxes, invisible unless someone needed something. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a whole damn production. Kyle was the charming one, the funny one, the one who brought home friends and awards and confidence that filled a room before he even walked into it. I, on the other hand, was sweet and quiet, which is parent code for forgettable. My school projects went unnoticed. My birthdays were quiet dinners at home. And when I made honor roll 3 years in a row, all I got was a, "That's great, honey," over a half-eaten meatloaf. But the moment that burned into me, the one I can't shake even now, happened in the fall of my senior year of high school. I had just gotten accepted into a competitive early college program. It was an Ivy League, but it was rigorous, and I had worked my ass off to get there. I brought the letter into the kitchen, trying not to smile too wide, hoping, just maybe, this would be the thing that finally lit a spark in them. My mom skimmed the page, set it down without finishing it, and said, "Emily, that's great, but you're not thinking about grad school already, are you? I mean, with how expensive things are, we really need to prioritize Kyle's future too." And then my dad chimed in with the line that stuck. "You're great, sweetie, but we don't want to throw money around unless there's a real return, you know? You're solid, just average. That's not bad, it's just, let's be realistic." I didn't cry, I didn't storm off, I just nodded like I understood. Because I did. I understood perfectly. I wasn't the investment. They were saving their applause, their pride, their money for someone who sparkled brighter. Kyle. Do you remember a time someone made you feel like you didn't deserve to dream? That's the kind of memory that lives in your bones. That night, while my parents were arguing over the cost of Kyle's private soccer coaching, I sat at my desk in silence and opened a blank document titled Applications. I didn't ask them to read my essays. I didn't tell them when interviews happened. I didn't mention that I was writing a thesis on neural computation in adolescence, or that my professor had said it was the strongest undergrad work he'd seen in a decade. I stopped sharing. Over the next 4 years, I built a second life, one that existed in library corners, lab basements, and late-night study rooms. My advisors became my mentors. My lab partners became my people. I presented at conferences, co-authored papers, and when I applied to a PhD program straight out of undergrad. They didn't just accept me, they offered me a fellowship. And I told no one. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't stand the thought of their lukewarm smiles, their forced good job, followed by a joke about Kyle's latest football stats. I let them believe I was working at a local admin job. I sent vague texts. I came home on holidays and let them talk about Kyle like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. When they asked about my little job, I smiled and nodded, knowing they'd never ask for details. They didn't care enough to see the truth, and that became my shield. Then came the day Kyle graduated, not college, high school. And I'll never forget the way they planned that damn party. They rented a white stretch limo, hired a DJ who spun throwback 90s hits like it was Coachella, and even got clearance from the HOA for a fireworks display. Fireworks. For finishing high school. I stood in the corner, holding a warm soda, watching everyone toast him like he'd just landed on the moon. And I thought to myself, not one person in this crowd knows I'm 3 months away from defending my dissertation. Not one of them knows I've been published, that I've done something statistically almost impossible. I was 23. I was on track to be the youngest PhD graduate in state history, and I was still standing in the goddamn corner of my brother's graduation party, like a waitress who forgot her uniform. But you know what? I stayed silent. I didn't say a word, because I had a different kind of fireworks planned. And when they finally went off, nobody would be looking at Kyle anymore. They'd all be staring at me. People like to believe that silence means agreement, that if you don't push back or scream or throw things, you must be fine with how things are. That quiet equals peace, or worse, acceptance. But what they never seem to understand, what my parents, in all their selective affection, never even tried to grasp, is that silence, when it takes root deep enough, becomes a kind of storm brewing beneath your skin. A slow and private rebellion that doesn't need an audience to be real. I didn't act out. I didn't break curfews or flunk classes or come home drunk just to get their attention. I simply disappeared from the version of their world where Kyle was the sun, and everything else orbited around him. The thing is, I wasn't average. I was cautious. I was methodical. I paid attention when no one thought I was watching. When I overheard my dad telling my aunt that Emily's sweet, but not exactly lighting the world on fire, I didn't cry or storm off. I filed that sentence away in my mental archive, like evidence in a case I was building against the life they had handed me. And instead of shouting back, I did something far more dangerous. I worked. While they were obsessing over Kyle's varsity letters and weekend tournaments, I was spending 12-hour days buried in books, tapping into a part of myself even I hadn't realized was there, until nobody expected anything from me. I applied for scholarships late at night, sitting cross-legged on my twin bed with a cracked laptop and noise-canceling headphones that became more of a lifeline than any conversation I ever had with my mom. I had no cheering section, no you can do it notes tucked into my lunchbox. But what I did have was space, the kind of emotional void that, ironically, gave me the freedom to build something that was entirely mine. College wasn't just an escape, it was a transformation. In those classrooms and labs, I stopped being Kyle's sister, or Mark and Sharon's quiet one. I became Emily, the student professors actually remembered by name, the one who asked questions that made people stop and think. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was mine. I joined a neuropsych lab the second semester of my freshman year, which was almost unheard of. And by junior year, I was already working on a research project that caught the attention of a visiting PhD advisor, who would later become the reason I got into my doctoral program, without a single letter from my family. I didn't tell them when I got accepted. I didn't even tell them I applied. I moved cities with 2 duffel bags, a backpack, and a brain full of numbers and theories most people couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. I lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat, shared Wi-Fi with the dry cleaner downstairs, and spent every waking hour bouncing between the lab, the library, and the microscopic kitchen where I ate too much instant ramen and not enough real food. But I was alive in a way I had never been under their roof. I wasn't just surviving, I was becoming someone. And yet, despite all that change, there was this lingering ache that never quite left me. A phantom pain from a family I'd stopped trying to impress but still wanted, somewhere deep down, to recognize that I mattered. Not because I had a title or because I made them proud by proxy, but because I was their daughter. But they never asked the questions that mattered. "How's your job?" My mom would text once every few months, and I'd reply with a single word: busy. They never pressed for details. They never dug deeper. It was easier for them to believe I was drifting somewhere comfortably average, maybe managing an office or doing temp work until marriage happened, or babies appeared to give them new pictures for the mantle. I didn't correct them. I let them live in that narrative because correcting them would have required them to care. And I didn't have the energy to throw pearls at people who'd only ever seen me as a placeholder. When Kyle got into state with a business major and a minor in party culture, I mean, he didn't say it like that, but it was clear. My parents practically threw a parade. They toured the campus with him, bought matching college sweatshirts, posted countdowns to move-in day, and shared every mediocre milestone like he was the first human being to step foot on a university campus. And when he came home that first summer, having barely scraped by with a 2.6 GPA and a citation for noise complaints, they still treated him like royalty. They blamed the school for not supporting his creativity. I had just completed my second year of grad school, published 2 papers, and was already drafting the framework for what would become my dissertation, all while teaching undergrad courses and mentoring freshmen who reminded me too much of my own lost self. And through it all, I stayed silent, because I had a plan. I knew one day I would graduate, not just walk across a stage, but stand on a podium, a finished product of every insult, every disregard, every year average that had ever been muttered with a shrug or a polite smile. And when that day came, I wouldn't need them to clap or cry or tell me they were proud. I wouldn't need anything from them at all, because by then, the world would see what they never cared to look at. And when they did, when their daughter's name made headlines, not because she chased attention, but because her work demanded it, I wouldn't rush to share it with them. I'd let them find it the way strangers do, with a stunned pause and a sinking realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd missed the most important thing to ever happen under their own roof. And that's the thing about being the quiet one. Eventually, people forget you were even in the room until your name is on every screen. And suddenly, they realize the silence was never emptiness. It was the sound of something unstoppable being built. There's something particularly cruel about watching a spectacle you were never invited to, even when you're standing right there, close enough to touch the champagne flutes and hear the beat of the music vibrating through the soles of your shoes, close enough to smile politely at people you don't know who look right past you as though you're part of the decoration, a lamp or a table someone forgot to move before the real celebration began. That was exactly how I felt that evening in late May, as I stood beneath a string of overpriced fairy lights in my parents' backyard, surrounded by faces glowing with cheap beer, artificial laughter, and an admiration that flowed in one direction only, straight at Kyle. My parents had spent the better part of 3 months planning the event like it was some high-profile gala rather than a high school graduation party. There were hand-delivered invitations embossed with gold leaf, a caterer who served bite-sized steaks on toothpicks, a rented tent the size of a small aircraft hangar, and a damn DJ who looked like he moonlighted in Vegas. They even brought in one of those stupid photo booths with props, plastic sunglasses, feather boas, and chalkboards for people to write things like Class of Legends or Too Hot for College. It was excessive in a way that made you wince, not because of the money, but because of how desperately my parents needed the world to see Kyle as the golden boy, the culmination of their hard work, the embodiment of all they believed mattered. And there I was, walking through the crowd in a modest dress I'd worn to 3 different conferences, unnoticed and unneeded, holding a plastic cup of lukewarm soda that I didn't even want. I watched people line up to take photos with Kyle in his cap and gown, even though the real ceremony had been the week before. And I listened to the DJ announce his name like he was the headliner at a concert instead of a kid who nearly flunked Algebra 2. They'd even ordered custom fireworks, set to go off at 9, to commemorate the moment their son officially entered adulthood, whatever the hell that meant to them. No one asked me what I'd been up to. No one even remembered that I was older than Kyle, that I'd once stood on the same lawn after finishing high school, with nothing more than a store-bought cake and a polite dinner at Olive Garden. Back then, they'd told me it wasn't worth making a fuss, that I'd have plenty of milestones ahead, and it was better to save the money for when it really counted. Apparently for Kyle, just surviving senior year counted more than my early college admission, my full ride scholarship, or my doctorate candidacy. I wasn't angry. Not the kind of angry that explodes or shatters dishes or starts fights. No, I felt something colder, something that settled in my bones and just sat there. Indifference laced with clarity, the kind of emotion that doesn't ask for revenge, but waits patiently for justice to arrive on its own schedule. I stood near the edge of the tent, watching as my parents posed with Kyle in front of the Us Class of Champions banner, and I realized, in that moment, they genuinely believed they'd done it right. They looked so proud, so convinced that they had built a family worth celebrating, and it struck me how delusional that was, how deep the denial ran. And then it happened. The moment that changed everything, the moment that no one could have scripted or seen coming, the moment I didn't even know I had been waiting for. A local news crew had been hired to film parts of the party, something my dad arranged after pulling some strings with a former high school friend who worked at the local station. It was supposed to be a fluff piece, a feel-good segment for the weekend broadcast about local grads and their families. They were walking through the crowd, interviewing parents and students, capturing B-roll footage of the party decor, the DJ spinning some corny remix, and Kyle throwing peace signs with his friends. And then the reporter, mid-30s, overly cheerful, wearing a red blazer like she was running for office, held up a microphone and said, "And let's not forget to celebrate another incredible accomplishment happening right here in our community. This week, the university confirmed that Emily Harper has officially become the youngest PhD graduate in state history, receiving her doctorate in cognitive neuroscience at just 23 years old." There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds long, where time just stopped. The music kept playing, but the sound didn't register. The laughter around me died off slowly, like the ending of a record being unplugged. People turned their heads, some mid-chew, others in the middle of conversation, eyes scanning the crowd for the name they'd just heard, processing the words as though they were in a different language. And then it hit them. Emily Harper. Me. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just stood there, watching their faces shift from confused amusement to stunned silence to a dawning horror that wasn't quite anger, but something more uncomfortable, recognition. My father's arm dropped from Kyle's shoulder. My mother blinked like she was trying to process a math problem that didn't add up. Kyle, for once in his life, had nothing to say. And I, the girl with no photos on the wall, no trophies on the shelf, and no fireworks to her name, stood there with my warm soda and a lifetime of restraint, and felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Not revenge, not pride, but a calm, calculated kind of satisfaction. Because in that moment, without me lifting a finger or saying a word, the truth had arrived. And for the first time in my life, the spotlight landed where it actually belonged. If you've ever watched a room recalibrate itself after a bombshell lands, you'll know that it doesn't happen all at once, like in the movies where the music screeches to a halt and everyone gasps in unison. No, it happens in waves. First the confusion, then the questions, and finally the turning of heads. The whispers pass like contraband under breath, the hurried attempts to rewrite the moment into something everyone can live with. That's exactly how it felt the day after the party, when the segment aired again, only this time, not just as a fluff piece buried in a local news slot, but picked up by a regional affiliate, broadcast statewide, and tagged under Youngest PhD in State History. The reporter's voice had that signature blend of enthusiasm and reverence that news anchors use when they don't fully understand the subject, but know it's supposed to be important. The footage showed a photo of me, not from the party, obviously, because no one had taken any, but one lifted from the university's website, a professional headshot in front of a bookshelf, where I looked polished, almost unrecognizably confident, dressed in a blazer I'd borrowed from a friend because I couldn't afford my own back then. And just like that, the story began to grow legs. Emails came first, from professors, from old classmates, even from former high school acquaintances who had apparently always believed I'd go far, though they'd never found the time to say so before. The university wanted me to speak at a commencement ceremony being held that Saturday, a joint celebration for summer and early graduates, something they usually reserve for alumni or notable figures from academia or politics. I was floored, and I accepted, not because I needed the validation, but because I knew what it meant to finally take up space in a way I had never allowed myself to before. The auditorium was packed. not just with students, but with faculty, administrators, and news cameras now interested in the local girl done extraordinary storyline that practically wrote itself. I stood backstage listening to the introductions, heart hammering so hard I could feel the rhythm in my teeth, trying not to think about the fact that, for the first time in my life, my parents had actually RSVP'd to something of mine and shown up. They were sitting in the front row, right next to Kyle, whose expression when we briefly locked eyes was something between awe and confusion, like he couldn't decide whether he was supposed to cheer for me or brace for impact. When I stepped up to the podium, the applause was warm, generous even. But my hands stayed steady, my voice even, because I had rehearsed this, not the speech itself, but this moment, this exact intersection of past pain and present triumph, where the urge to explode with years of pent-up resentment wrestled with the poise I had spent years cultivating. "I wasn't supposed to be here," I began, my voice filling the space not like a roar, but like a slow wave rolling in, deliberate and unshakable. Not because I lacked the grades or the drive, but because, like too many of us, I was told, implicitly, sometimes outright, that I was ordinary. I was good enough to keep things running smoothly, to not make trouble, to do what was expected, and not 1 inch more. But no one ever cheered when I succeeded. No one ever said, "This one might just change the world." The room was dead silent. Even the babies in the crowd, usually unpredictable in these settings, seemed to sense that something important was being said. I continued, weaving a story not just about me, but about what it means to be overlooked, underestimated, and then to rise anyway, not in spite of it, but because of it. I talked about the value of quiet excellence, of relentless consistency, and how, sometimes, the people who don't shine in childhood end up being the ones who carry the weight of progress when no one's watching. And then, with the slightest pause, I shifted my gaze directly toward the front row, where my parents sat with expressions I couldn't quite read. Was it pride? Was it guilt? Or was it simply discomfort at being so conspicuously absent from a narrative they never thought to ask about? "I want to thank everyone who believed in me," I said, letting the sentence hang in the air just long enough to sting. "And I especially want to thank those who didn't, because in their silence, I found my own voice. And in their doubts, I built a determination that couldn't be ignored." There was applause again, louder now, and I stepped back from the microphone without looking back. I didn't need to see their faces to know that the message had landed. This wasn't revenge, not in the sharp, cinematic way people imagine it, but it was something quieter and more enduring. It was a reckoning, wrapped in eloquence and delivered without a single raised voice. After the ceremony, a few faculty members offered congratulations, some posed for photos, and several parents approached me with the kind of praise usually reserved for keynote speakers flown in from out of state. My own parents stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure of their place in this version of my life. My mother, ever the planner, finally stepped forward and said, "We had no idea you were doing something so impressive. Why didn't you tell us?" And I looked at her, really looked, and replied with a soft, level tone, "Because you never asked. No drama, no tears, just truth. Because sometimes the most powerful speech you'll ever give isn't the one into a microphone. It's the one where you finally stop needing permission to matter." In the days that followed the speech, something in the dynamic between my family and me shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but with the slow, aching inevitability of tectonic plates moving beneath the surface, quiet enough to ignore if you weren't paying attention, but powerful enough to change the landscape forever. My phone, once silent during holidays and birthdays, unless I initiated contact, began to vibrate with a frequency that felt unnatural, like a stranger knocking on a door that had long since been painted shut. First, there were the texts, short, cautious messages from my mother that sounded like she had copy-pasted them from a parenting blog. "So proud of you," and "You've always been brilliant, we were just too busy to see it maybe," each one betraying the fact that she didn't quite know how to talk to a version of me who no longer sought her approval. Then came my father, always the less communicative of the two, whose approach was even more disjointed. He sent a blurry photo of me from the news segment with a caption that simply read, "You look like a real professor there," as though that were some half-baked olive branch that could bridge 23 years of quiet dismissal. And finally, of course, Kyle chimed in with a half-joking, half-sincere text that read, "Guess I'm the underachiever now, huh?" A message I didn't even bother to answer, because engaging with that kind of false humility would have only invited him to feel like he was part of my story again. And he wasn't, not really. When they invited me to dinner the following week, I almost declined, not out of spite, but because the idea of sitting at a table where I had once been invisible now felt like a regression, like stepping back into a play where I no longer belonged. But curiosity, or maybe something closer to resolve, won out in the end, and I agreed. Not for closure, I didn't need it, but because I wanted to see, firsthand, what they looked like now that the curtain had been pulled back. The dinner was at a local steakhouse, the kind of place that tried to look expensive with dark wood panels and cloth napkins, but still offered bottomless fries like that was some kind of luxury. We sat in a booth near the back, and for the first 10 minutes, the conversation danced around the obvious, full of small talk and performative smiles, like they were all collectively pretending that nothing seismic had occurred. My mother complimented my dress, my father asked vague questions about what's next, and Kyle, ever the center of attention, talked about some new internship he had lined up through a friend of a friend who owed our dad a favor. It was surreal sitting there, listening to them try to fold me back into the old family narrative, as though they could somehow rewrite the past by being present now. And then my mother did what I suppose she thought was brave. She brought up the past, haltingly, like someone afraid of waking a ghost. She said they regretted not showing more interest when I was younger, that they hadn't realized how much I had accomplished on my own, and that they wanted to be more involved now to make up for lost time. My father nodded, a silent endorsement, and Kyle even managed a sheepish, "Yeah, I guess we kind of dropped the ball." For a moment, I just looked at them, not with anger or resentment, but with the same clinical detachment I used in the lab when examining data that no longer surprised me. And then I said something I hadn't rehearsed, but knew, deep down, I was always going to say. "I'm glad you came tonight," I began, my tone calm, almost gentle, which only made the weight of the words heavier. "And I appreciate the gesture, really, but I need you to understand something. I didn't get here because of you. I got here despite you. I built this life without your support, without your pride, and without any belief in me except the belief I taught myself to have. So you don't get to arrive now, at the finish line, and act like you were part of the race." The silence that followed was thick, not awkward but necessary, the kind of silence that burns because it carries the truth in every second it stretches. My mother's face fell slightly, but she didn't cry, which surprised me. My father just looked down, focusing too hard on his plate, while Kyle muttered something about needing the restroom and excused himself. I took a sip of water, folded my napkin, and stood up. "I wish you well," I said, not with bitterness, but with a finality that couldn't be misinterpreted. "But I'm not here to make you feel better about how things turned out. I'm here to make sure you understand that your absence taught me how to be present for myself. And that's the only lesson I needed from you." Then I left, walking out into the humid night air, past parked cars and polite valets, into a world that felt entirely mine, not because they had finally noticed me, but because I had stopped needing them to. That was the real payback. Not some explosive confrontation or public humiliation. Not a clever jab or bitter retort, but a quiet, undeniable truth. That I had become everything they never expected. And I didn't need them to clap for me. Because some victories don't need an audience. And some stories are better when the people who wrote the first chapter don't get to write the last.